Well, good morning. Today we are going to be moving into Mark chapter 13. And there's a little bit of a shift, I guess, that takes place here in Mark chapter 13. This chapter kind of acts as a transition from what we've been seeing and into the actual final preparations for Jesus's death, his crucifixion, and ultimately his resurrection. And so it's very interesting, and it's kind of exciting to look at. This entire chapter really deals with the future in the sense of what to expect and how do we understand the end times. And so we're gonna look at that. We're gonna see a little bit of that today, whereas we're gonna kind of get the introduction. We're gonna set the scene for it. And so we begin in verse 1 of Mark chapter 13, which it begins, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings." Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives across from the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Now you might be sitting there thinking, "Oh, well, why'd we stop there?" I mean, that's a good question. The reality is, yes, those are very good questions. Those are good questions that we've been asking since Jesus. His disciples began the question asking, and we continue to ask those very same questions today, because we want to know, how do we prepare for the future? How do we get ready? And when Jesus makes these comments about the future, they stir in us these questions of, really, that's going to happen when? How? Why? And it's natural, right? I think so anyway. But I'm naturally a curious person. And so I have many questions that I would like to ask Jesus about these things. But let's first set the stage for the conversation. So we last time talked about the widow and her 2 coins that she gave. We talked about her generosity. We talked about a number of things, and all of that took place in the temple. So they've been in the temple, and so this is a natural place for this question to arise. And whether there's a lot of debate about whether or not the question was asked at the time that they were in the temple with the widow, watching her put in her 2 coins, or if Mark is inserting it here because it's a natural place for it. Either way, it really doesn't affect the meaning and what we're at here, because what's important is that the disciples were looking at the temple, and the temple was the temple that Herod had built, and I believe we've talked about that a little bit. And it truly was an amazing temple. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world, really, and it was just magnificent, huge, very decorative, very beautiful. And so it's not surprising that one of Jesus' disciples would make some comment about the beauty of it all. And, teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings. Interestingly enough, we're not told who this disciple is. We can speculate all we want. We can speculate that when they get across to the Mount of Olives, which, kind of is a hill that's, opposite Jerusalem. So, if you got Jerusalem sitting on one hill, you're going to have, the Mount of Olives, there's a little dip and then you get up to the Mount of Olives. So when they get over there, 4 of his disciples are named as having come to him. So it's very interesting. Sometimes you have the entire group hanging out with Jesus. Sometimes you have a smaller group. What's very interesting is normally the small group that is with Jesus is Peter, James, and John. And those 3 are here, but then there's Andrew as well. It's one of those details worth noting. We're not given any information as to why, so I think there's a number of possibilities as to why Andrew is mentioned here. One of those possibilities that crossed my mind, and I'm not the only one. I looked around to make sure I wasn't having weird thoughts or anything, but others have wondered if maybe Andrew was the one who asked the question. Now he's not named, and it doesn't say anywhere that he was. So we can't say for certain. We can't have any kind of real certainty that Andrew was the one that asked the question. But what we can do, and what we can say, is that it's a possibility. Number one, because it's very interesting. It's an unusual detail to add Andrew into the mix. And the other thing is, in ancient writing, it was not uncommon for a writer to introduce someone without naming them and save the naming for later. So it's kind of like a revelation of who it was. However, in this case, we can't say. So it's a possibility. What we can say is there's a historical fact to it, and so Mark is recording Peter's remembrances, and Peter, James, and John, and Andrew were there, and so Peter's remembering Andrew there and marking it as a historical reality. Another interesting fact is that Andrew in the book of Mark that is mentioned with these 3 way back in the beginning of the book, when Jesus called his first disciples, because he called Peter and his brother Andrew, and then James and John. And so as Jesus' public ministry is really coming to a close here, and he is shifting completely into this final week of his life, and he is preparing for his death, burial, and resurrection. Mark may be bookending this, so this might be a literary device for Mark, and whether he intended to do it or not, it does a great job of bookending the public ministry of Jesus. That the 4 that were the very first ones that he called would also be the 4 that he would get together with here toward the end to give these final words about the final days, and answers these big questions for them. And so it's just one of those things. I was struck by the inclusion of Andrew in that list here, and those are some of the reasons why it is entirely likely that he is number one, he was there. So it's just a historical notation, but further, it is also that bookending and that just it just makes everything point to the fact that Jesus' ministry is winding down. Whether at the time the disciples realized that or not, Jesus has been talking about it, Jesus has been warning them about it, but we don't really know how much they were really grasping it, other than the fact that it becomes apparent they didn't really understand entirely. but it does a great job of kind of showing, hey, look, guys, I've taught you everything. Now it's time to start preparing for the future. It's time to look forward and look down the road. It's now time to think through these things. And so that's how the whole conversation that's going to unravel in the chapter begins, right? And it starts with this kind of this recognition of the beauty of the temple, and it gets right into it. And as we dive into this, beginning with that observation, right? And the temple was beautiful, and Jesus never denies that. I've heard some preachers try to use this as kind of Jesus rebuking the disciple for focusing on the earthly things, but there's no rebuke there. I think Jesus would have agreed, yeah, no, this is magnificent, but do you see all this magnificence? Guess what? It's not going to last. So the first thing, when we're preparing for the future, right? So the first thing that we get out of this, I think, is the recognition that everything is temporary. Everything. See, these big buildings with all the stone structures, they're temporary. There's still things hanging around from that era, and even a little bit before, some stone structures, and the Romans were amazing engineers and just built some amazing things that have lasted. Their highway system is still there. There's places you can walk on the highway that the Romans built during the height of the Roman Empire. I mean, it's amazing. But guess what? It's all temporary. You can see a lot of the ruins, and there's a lot of great stuff, but those buildings are done. They're over. One of the tragedies of World War II was some ancient structures in Europe ended up being bombed because Nazis would hide things in them or whatever, and they just became casualties of war. And to think that something that has stood for almost 2,000 years is destroyed by a conflict that we're having, that's but it's another reminder, everything is temporary. The rocks are temporary. And so this earth is temporary now. It'll outlast you and me probably. I mean, unless something extremely cataclysmic happens, this earth will outlast us, but it will eventually come to an end. Everything is temporary. And no matter how magnificent you feel it is, no matter how marvelous, everything in this world has a lifespan, has a beginning and an end. And so when we're preparing for the future, we have to recognize that. I think that's one of the first things we really need to wrestle with is everything around us is temporary. And so that really opens our eyes. And I think it is an eye-opening thing, because the disciples might not have even thought about that. It's like, it's all gonna be torn down, huh? And so they come to Jesus with these two questions, with tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And so what this tells us is they at least had some recognition of the fact that your knowledge is limited. Your knowledge is limited. We don't know everything. There's so much we don't know, and there are things that we want to know because we don't know. That's the interesting thing, right? They come to Jesus because they want to know. Now we can argue, and it will become apparent, right? A little spoiler alert, I guess. Sometimes what we want to know isn't what we need to know. And sometimes the questions that we have are not the questions we need to be asking. And what's so amazing, and what we'll find out about Jesus, is Jesus answers the questions that we ask, but he answers them in the way that we need to hear them. So if we have a question of, well, when is this going to happen, and that's the wrong question, the answer he's going to give us is going to be the answer we need, not the answer we necessarily want. Because throughout we'll find out that this when question is really the wrong question to be asking. And indeed, we can look at it, the when question. So when is all this going to happen? What do you mean this magnificent building is going to be torn down? Well, this actually would happen, and some of them would still be alive when it happened in 70 AD, when the Romans came in and they destroyed the temple. They were putting down yet another rebellion in Jerusalem, and this time they decided that they were going to take away the very heart of the Jewish life and culture. And so they destroyed the temple. A very devastating thing for many Jews. And this took place around 70 AD. And so Jesus is looking at it, and so on one level, when 70 AD is when this is going to start. But what we're going to find out is that's not the totality of what Jesus is talking about. Jesus has a much bigger thing in mind here. He has a whole bigger picture of not just the when is the temple going to be destroyed, why is it going to be destroyed? What is the purpose, and why would God allow it? Interesting questions. We'll dig into those. They're kind of like those little, episodes you watch of your favorite series where it's a cliffhanger, and they do that so that you'll come back. Back in the day, they used to end a lot of like a season on a cliffhanger, and to make you come back and see how it all wraps up. And so we're going to kind of do that here. Is some of these questions that we're raising today, we're not necessarily going to answer today, which again reinforces the fact our knowledge is limited. My knowledge is limited, your knowledge is limited, and it's illustrated by the fact that we're not going to get into all of our questions today. We're still going to have questions, and that's good. Honestly, I think it's marvelous, and some people will criticize the disciples because they're asking when, and when you get into the book of Acts, they're still asking when, and still not understanding that's the wrong question to be asking, but they're at least asking it, right? They're at least asking questions. And who are they asking? They're asking Jesus. And this brings us to our final thought from here, and that is, trust the one who knows. You see, Jesus has the answers. These guys, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, come to Jesus, and they ask him. Now, it doesn't say that they didn't discuss it with themselves first. They may have had quite a nice little discussion about this on their own. We don't know, but what we do know is they went to Jesus with their questions, and that's what we should do. Why? Because we realize everything is temporary, which means we really, in this world, right, there's not anything we can really solidly put our faith in, and nothing that we can really just rock solid have 100% certainty of knowing, because things change. And throughout history, people have believed very solidly certain things for very good reasons. I read it's been a couple of years now, but I read a biography on Albert Einstein, and his just a brilliant scientist. But even within his own lifetime, a lot of his scientific beliefs were being debunked by other scientific discoveries, and he really wrestled with a lot of that. And he wrestled with the fact that so many things that he was so certain about were being disproved because he couldn't find any one thing in the entirety of the universe that he could really say for certain was true and would remain true. And that's how we are. Which reinforces our knowledge is limited. Which brings us to the need to trust the one who knows. Now, of course, that means we have to find the one who knows. Who knows? Who does know? Who has the answers to our questions? And obviously, I'm going to answer Jesus. Because I believe he does. I believe that it is absolutely vital that we learn to bring our questions to Jesus, whatever those questions are. And you might think that your question is silly, or you might think that it's childish, or you might think that it's like somehow it's off base. You might feel like somebody's going to criticize you the way a lot of people criticize the disciples for continually asking, when is this going to happen? But the reality is, again, I don't see any criticism in Jesus' response. And, you know, if you haven't read the rest of the chapter, then you're not aware of this, but I have read the rest of the chapter, and I have not found any criticism that Jesus had. As a matter of fact, he seemed quite happy to sit down and have a discussion with them and address their questions and reveal to them the questions they really needed to be concerned with. And that's a good thing. Because he knows. Because he is not just another person. He is God in the flesh. He came down from heaven. So he does have the answers that we need. And so it is that we need to learn to trust him. That we come to him and we bring to him whatever our questions are, whatever our concerns are, whatever our struggles are. And we trust him because we believe, for good reason, that he knows. He has the answers. And so what questions do you have? Whatever they are, take them to Jesus. Trust Jesus. Because he does know. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we come before you today and we want to thank you for your great love for us. We do thank you that indeed in a world where we cannot know everything, where our knowledge is limited, we thank you that we can turn to you with the full confidence that your knowledge is not limited, that you know and you understand all things, and you have every answer that we need. And we thank you that you allow us to ask whatever questions we have, that you don't criticize us, even if we're asking questions that are a little off base, even if our focus is wrong, and so we're asking the wrong questions. You don't criticize us. You help us along and broaden our understanding and help us see the things that we should be seeing. And we just thank you for that. And we thank you for your great love, your grace, your mercy. And I pray, Lord, that you would pour that out on us this coming week. I pray, Lord, that we would experience your love, your forgiveness, your acceptance each and every day. And help us to share that and share with others how they can experience it too. Thank you. We praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.